Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to another Conversations on Migration in the Caribbean. I am so happy to be bringing you another episode out of the four-part series. I'm so excited to be joined by so many activists and young people who are really trying to make our world a better place. And I feel like this is the right time. I want to encourage you guys, those of you who are just logging on, to come on in and share the live and show your support and um, reach out to somebody, tag somebody who might be interested in the conversation that we're about to have. And of course, we are talking about climate justice, and it is the climate justice series as we, of course, look at the global climate crisis. It is essential for us to recognize that its impacts are felt equally across different regions and communities, or I should say, unequally across different regions and communities. In the Caribbean region, we have the small island developing states. Change is for us, it's not an abstract threat, but it's an immediate and lived reality. Hurricanes, rising sea levels, and other environmental disasters are continuously challenging the social, the economic, and the environmental resilience of our people. We've had events like T.S. Erica in 2015, we had Hurricane Matthew in 2016, Hurricanes Irma and Maria 2017, Dorian in 2019, the eruption of La Sofia volcano in 2020. Hundreds of people are being displaced and were actually displaced just literally 2 months ago by Hurricane Beryl in Grenada, that included Carriacou and Petit Martinique, Jamaica, as well as St. Vincent and the Grenadines. In the Caribbean, our call for climate justice calls attention to the way that these climate events have disproportionately impacted our Caribbean countries. Hurricane Maria in 2017, for instance, caused so much damage that was worth approximately 225%. These events call for crucial sustainable development initiatives, and our governments and people are challenged to access the finance for adaptation and mitigation. Marginalized groups need to be included in our responses to climate change, and there is a need for participatory approaches to leave no one behind. I'd like to welcome you to the Climate Justice Series. This is day three, like I mentioned earlier. And if you're viewing on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, I'm your host, JL Joseph, and I'd like to introduce you to my co host, Maxine Arlene X3, who serves as the Communications Officer for IOM Caribbean. Welcome, Maxine.
Thank you, Jael. Good morning, good morning, good morning to everyone who's on. Good evening if you're from, you're joining us from somewhere else in the world. It's really good to be here. Been a really exciting and insightful series so far. Today is day three, and we wrap up tomorrow. So thank you so much for joining us, and I am just really excited and looking forward to today.
Of course,
So
it's nice to see you again, Maxine. And I know you've been behind the scenes working and putting this together. And I just want to commend you on the hard work that you're doing with IOM Caribbean. Y'all don't play. Y'all don't play.
we have to represent. There's a lot of work to do. A lot of
Yes.
work to do. A lot of work to do. So I guess I'm gonna go on and quickly introduce you to all of our guests. This morning we have three youth leaders from one from Dominica, one from the Bahamas, and one from Barbados with us. These are people who have been activists and leaders in their own right, and we're just really looking forward to hearing their voices today. So first up on my screen is Ferguson Valmore. And it's interesting first because he is also one of the first peoples. He's a Kalinago from Dominica. And also we discovered that he is a member of the UN High Level Climate Champions Group, and he's the youngest. He is also the first Caribbean person to be a part of that high level climate champions group. He is the first Dominican on that group, and he's the first indigenous person. So it is, I guess it's just right and proper that he's the first on the screen and the first that I introduce as well. So welcome, Fudison, and thank you for joining us today. I'm going to move on to Lauren. And so Lauren is joining us from the Bahamas. Lauren considers herself to be a climate storyteller. She also is involved in a publication, the Eco Justice Project, bringing representation to marginalized people in the Caribbean. And she's a documentary filmmaker. So Lauren, thank you for joining us, and we really look forward to your perspective today. And then Yemi Knight. Yemi is a conservationist and climate activist. She's the founder of the Anchor Bridge International in Barbados, and she is very much involved in climate justice and human rights. She also co-authored an IOM policy brief. A policy brief that was co-authored by herself and with IOM, looking at LGBTQI rights in evacuation planning. So welcome to all three of you. And Jill, I'm going to hand right back over to you so that we can begin the conversation.
Thank you very much, Maxine. I'm constantly checking back to make sure to see who's communicating. People are coming on from all the different channels, and we want to make sure that we grab every single one of them. And from time to time, I'll pull up some of the comments in front of the screen as we go along. So thanks again for the introduction, and welcome to our most esteemed and distinguished panelists who are joining us from all across the Caribbean. And I'm going to get started with Yemi. Yemi, you are one of the co-authors of a recent policy paper on how to make environmental migration and evacuation more inclusive for people with diverse sexual orientation, gender identities, gender expressions, and sex characteristics. In the Caribbean, emergency shelters that people are or would be evacuated to are generally public buildings such as schools, community centers, and other buildings that are repurposed to accommodate evacuees. In addition, with the countries running on very tight budgets, these issues tend to not be or get prioritized. How do you see the needs of marginalized people being taken care of, given the very economic constraints faced by small island developing states in the Caribbean and in the rest of the world?
Thanks for that question, Jill. That's a question I also ruffle with, and I'm met with all the time whenever I present the findings of my paper. So before I can answer that question specifically, I just want to give you some insights, which is some policies and plans do not explicitly include marginalized groups. I'm talking LGBTQ individuals, undocumented migrants, people living with chronic illnesses. And so it's making it challenging to address their needs effectively. And even with tight budgets, it's my personal opinion that policies can be shaped, existing policies and projects can be shaped with inclusivity in mind. So there are many no cost to low cost steps that we can take, such as expanding demographic questions in censuses that are done every 10 years. And we can capture valuable data on vulnerable groups. I know that most disaster organizations have annual trainings already. So we can just include specific modules for these individuals, these individual groups. So if there's a gender responsive module, you can include specific safeguards for LGBTQ people with a specific emphasis on trans individuals, where most of the challenges and inequities lie in the discussion in general. And then I believe that can improve our preparedness for these disasters in the future. Another thing I want to touch on is that many Caribbean countries sign on to human rights treaties via the UN and the Inter-American Human Rights System. And so I believe that human rights laws and principles such as non-discrimination, the right to adequate housing and healthcare must underpin migration frameworks. And so in that, we can start building genuine connections with CSOs, NGOs, so that the needs of that deal with these vulnerable groups, so that the needs of these specific groups can be addressed. This is by way of design and implementation of solutions. So all of these are very low cost efforts and things that we can do. And then we can also leverage regional support. So right now, the Caribbean, there's a plan to implement a regional migration policy. In those discussions, we can include these vulnerable groups. And then we can also seek to expand our support internationally. So it's my firm opinion that we shouldn't let economic constraints stop us from even discussing or taking action. Once marginalized groups are included meaningfully, then we can address those resource constraints and those resource questions. That's all I have for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Yemi, and thank you for your contribution. I'll move on now to Lorraine. Of course, we know climate change influences how and why people move. It can drive people to move for job opportunities or force them to move due to its impacts or require developing plans for entire communities to relocate to safer areas. The Bahamas was heavily impacted by Hurricane Dorian back in 2019, with the entire island communities really being leveled. There was an additional dynamic that some of the most impacted people were actually low-income Bahamians and migrants, mainly from Haiti, and they were actually living in makeshift communities. How would you link human mobility and climate justice to the plight of these groups and their prospects for resilient recovery?
Thank you for that question. I think when we talk about climate justice, we first acknowledge it on the global scale. And that is why countries like the Bahamas, our small island nations in the Caribbean, are disproportionately impacted by climate disasters year after year, despite the fact that we don't contribute the most to the causes of climate change. But even within our countries, we find that there's varying levels of inequity and vulnerability due to factors like socioeconomic status and migrant status. And in a lot of ways, it takes climate disasters and climate change to reveal these inequities and expose vulnerable areas like the Mud community in Marsh Harbor in Abaco, which was a very large Haitian migrant community, and a lot of low-income individuals living with inadequate physical infrastructure and resources. And it made these communities a lot more susceptible to devastation after the storm. But even afterwards, you'll find a lack of financial safety nets and formal employment and social services to rebuild. And in some cases as well, a lack of humanitarian support when it comes to migrant communities who are faced with prejudice and discrimination, and face threats of deportation and penalization for their status when they come forward for help. So a large majority of the death toll and the missing persons that we saw in the Bahamas after Hurricane Dorian were undocumented migrants who weren't accounted for and low-income people from migrant communities. So I think when we think about human mobility within the Caribbean as well, you see that a lot of these migrants have fled their home countries due to sociopolitical turmoil and other climate disasters, and they're refugees and they're asylum seekers. So for them to come to the Bahamas and build these informal settlements just to then suffer the most severe consequences of disaster, to be displaced yet again with little to no ability to rebuild, it's a very vicious cycle. And it's one that will be further exacerbated as climate impacts become stronger and more frequent. So if we're looking at climate disaster recovery within a climate justice framework, we need to prioritize the needs of the most vulnerable communities that are affected by the storms when we're thinking about disaster planning and our recovery efforts. This is when it comes to equitable distribution of aid, but also our investment in resilient infrastructure, accessible shelters, but also communication channels with these communities that are often ignored. So I think the government has long ignored our migrant populations, and that discrimination and exclusion is only going to further marginalize them during times of crisis. And even in recent years, we found that the government has demolished these communities, has forbidden them to rebuild. So if there's no targeted action or protections to address the fact that these people do exist within our country and that they are in danger, we won't have any policies that are truly grounded in human rights and recognize the rights of all of these individuals. So I think even thinking about us here in the Bahamas, and again, outside of just migrants, we also have low-income Bahamians who are very severely impacted and face the threat of becoming climate refugees ourselves. We need to focus on addressing our inequities head on, the socioeconomic inequities, and thinking about long-term resilience that's more than just rebuilding what we've lost, but also creating these systems and mechanisms that can better withstand future impacts and really think about our path forward that is more inclusive.
Thank you very much for sharing, Lauren. We truly appreciate your contribution. And we move on to Ferguson. We know Hurricane Maria devastated Dominica in 2017, causing damage worth over 220% of the national income of the country. The indigenous Kalinago community located on the Atlantic coast of the island was amongst the hardest hit. However, at a panel discussion at the SIDS 4 conference last May, the Minister of Environment and Kalinago Affairs noted that the community began recovery efforts immediately without waiting on government intervention. How should indigenous resilience be interpreted in climate justice discussions? That is for you, Ferguson.
Thank you, JL. So firstly, I'd like to really answer your question with a question. So what do we as individuals consider to be indigenous resilience? I, of course, have been pondering this question in my mind, entering all these spaces, these climate-related spaces, of course, and I've come to the realization that resilience, besides the dictionary definition, that resilience is more about strength, the adaptability, and of course, the proactive strategies of communities like my community, the Kalinago territory, in the face of many environmental disasters, including Hurricane Maria, like you said. So our immediate response to, like I said, the traumatic devastation reflects not just our survival instincts as indigenous peoples, of course, but rather our deep-rooted knowledge on the strong sense of a community. And we in Dominica, of course, like to call it Kudme. It's the spirit of togetherness and unity. It's the very essence, the very fabric of our identity as Dominicans, as indigenous peoples. Now, the resilience we tend to speak about, or we're speaking about right now, it challenges the narrative that we, of course, and indigenous peoples really are passive victims of the climate crisis, but rather it highlights our agencies emphasizing that we often possesses this critical and important knowledge needed of sustainable practices. And of course, we can contribute to really lessening the impacts of climate change, not only for SIDS, but worldwide speaking in general. Now, as we look at discussions surrounding climate justice, it's really a space that not much indigenous voices have been able to enter. And I'm speaking from experience myself. I have just started entering the spaces where we speak about climate justice. And we need to recognize that communities, indigenous communities, have an essential role to play. We bring our unique relationship, of course, with nature. That's one. This, of course, is shaped by centuries of stewardship and adaptation. We're talking about climate adaptation. We're talking about replenishment of the environment, etc. All our sustainable practices can, of course, or helped protect Mother Nature, as we like to call it. So acknowledging the indigenous resilience, again, we're speaking about the indigenous resilience, the strength, adaptability, and unity of indigenous peoples and local communities. It really shifts the focus more away from what is often described as external aid per se. And it really should advocate for policies that support indigenous leadership in recovery and climate adaptation initiatives. When we speak about climate justice, we're often speaking about climate finance. We need all these finances. But I like to say, as we like to say in Dominica, have it at home, carry it abroad. So let's really shift the narrative on the national level before we decide to go out there on the regional and international level. We need to really fix some things in our backyard before we go, because we need these mechanisms on the national level that will, of course, correspond to what we're calling for from the international communities, or those that are responsible for contributing significantly to the climate crisis. So, of course, from an indigenous youth perspective, this means ensuring that our voices as persons, vulnerable people, people who are affected by the climate crisis, of course, this means that we have to ensure our leaders, or we need to ensure that our voices are included in these decision-making processes. and that our traditional ecological knowledge, of course, are integrated in policy, in crafting the various legislation that will not only protect just indigenous peoples, but we're talking from society, from a societal perspective. Of course, just to sum up my contribution, acknowledging the indigenous resilience, building resilience for indigenous communities and local communities. So we need to really recognize climate justice discussions and really honor the legacy of what we're talking about. So this recognition validates our unique perspectives and contributions, which of course often overlooked in mainstream climate narratives, or according to how we like to say it, facts, FATC facts. So that's the reality. Indigenous voices are often overlooked, or we tend to enter spaces where tokenism really exists. And I'm speaking from experience again. Many of these spaces that we enter, that we just want to tick off the box that indigenous peoples are included in the discussions, that we trying to accomplish diversity to some extent. So how are we meaningfully integrated as indigenous peoples? How are our knowledge to addressing the various societal issues integrated into your policies, into your programs? We need to really shift away from that narrative and that stance, that mentality that indigenous peoples are very useless. And yes, people think that way. Indigenous people are not educated. They can be doctors, lawyers, etc. So now we really need to have that voice included in the policy discussion. So indigenous practices, of course, often prioritize sustainability and biodiversity. So our knowledge, of course, can be integrated into the broader climate strategies from the national level and international level. So we need to really see our contribution as more as a collaboration. And I've been saying that as an advocate for meaningful youth engagement in decision-making processes. Now we need to see indigenous peoples as partners rather than victims of the climate change, or passive recipients of the effects of the climate crisis. Only when this collaboration can be seen or can be put in place, that ecosystems' health, the adaptive resilience, and of course, ultimately contributing to a sustainable future. So the time is now that indigenous peoples are recognized for who they are. They are the holders of the key to protecting the planet and Mother Nature from every single level. Thank you so much.
Period. Period. Drops the mic, exit. Wow. That was powerful, Maxine. I saw you writing away and you're like,
Yeah, I mean, he was first in the introduction, but he like, so this has been so interesting because I see that we started off with Yemi speaking about ensuring that people are included, right? And I think one of the things with minority communities is that very often, from a human level, the policymakers, the people who are involved in offering the trainings and writing the policies and so on, don't actually understand the real human issues. So Ferguson just spoke about inclusion and collaboration. It is so important, I think, for these communities, all of these communities, and not just ticking the boxes, but for real inclusion and engagement of all of these communities so that we understand what the issues are. Because I know that there are, for instance, disaster managers and people involved in disaster management throughout the region who, yes, we talk about the the need to have gender issues taken into consideration, but they've not really gone into thinking about, okay, what is it that really makes accommodation of men different, accommodation of women different, and accommodation of people who have diverse sexual orientations different. And even if we can't accomplish everything at one time, and even if we may not agree with certain lifestyles as policymakers, the fact is that there are human challenges that exist, and our commitment is to leave no one behind. We've all accepted that, to leave no one behind. So how do we actually get this going? So I also saw resilience, and we've been having this discussion about resilience. And you almost get to this stage when you've been affected a few times, you get to the stage where you start resenting this word
I don't want to
resilience,
be resilient.
right? And so my thing is that resilience is not an excuse for exclusion. And okay, these people are fine, so we can, they're resilient. No, resilience is a reason for inclusion. Resilience is a reason to include and to engage and to collaborate, right? Lauren, you spoke about the local, the global, the tendency to deal with climate justice at a global level, but that we bring it down now to local, and we see that the climate change and climate events are showing up the inequalities in our local communities, and so we really need to take care of those. But there is no two ways about it, a global responsibility. There's a global responsibility because when you have 225% of your GDP in damage in one event overnight, there's no way that you can take on the resilience actions that you need to take on your own.
And
right?
also to focus on all of the different issues that happened as a result, the mental aspect of it, the health aspect of it, I said the psychology, the economic aspect of it. We have people still living in Dominica, still have tarpaulin on their homes, and we're in 2024,
yeah.
right?
You have children who every time the rain falls, they get traumatized.
Yeah.
You have families that have been broken apart because of displacement of people away from their countries or into different communities, people's livelihoods that they've never been able to recover because they were fisher folk, they were farmers in communities that have now been totally relocated, right? So our time is short, and so we can't go into this too much, and we're all passionate, but so I want to ask to all of you now, COP29 is coming up in a few weeks' time, just about a month. What message, and Yemi, you're going to be attending, IOM is sending you to COP29. So this is an opportunity, for you to really, I guess, distill what is your message going to be? What's your core message going to be? What are you guys, what message do you want to send to world leaders and to your local leaders as well? Because we brought this up here about achieving climate justice for the Caribbean and in the Caribbean.
Yemi.
Yeah, good.
Okay. I'm actually very, very honored to be selected as a part of the cohort by the IOM. The IOM has been very, very supportive in my journey in general, my advocacy journey. I've gotten a resounding level of support from you all here and the others on the team. So I'm really grateful for that. I'm still trying to refine my message, but I think one key point is clear, that there is no climate justice without addressing human rights. We cannot separate the two. We must ensure protection for all vulnerable groups. I'm talking LGBTQ people, women, girls, people with disabilities, houseless people. All groups need to be included. And a key reason why they need to be included is because that these issues often intersect. You find in the LGBTQ people can also be people living with disabilities, can also be houseless. These issues often intersect. So we can't address support for one group and not the other. It's simply not feasible, and it simply makes no sense, quite frankly. And so I think world leaders need to genuinely have genuine commitment. I saw Ferguson say, I saw Lauren said it. We can't tokenize people. We have to have them integrated into the planning, the design, the implementation, every step along the way. I saw some Facebook users also say that vulnerable groups need to be included in all levels of the planning, because we have people who are educated, like Ferguson said. There are LGBTQ people. There are people who living with disabilities that are educated, that have the skill set. So there's no need to include them. We need to even get rid of the old guard in many ways, and have these groups included. And it's only then that we do that we can genuinely fight for climate justice. So that would be my message for world leaders, high-end people. We need to have genuine interactions, because there's no climate justice without the consideration of human rights.
Thank you very much, Yemi. Thank you for your contribution. And Lauren, we'll move on to you.
I agree with everything that's being said, and I'm really grateful that human rights are being centered in this conversation. I think thinking about COP29, a lot of our COPs are about calling for accountability for major polluters, looking at who's most responsible for the climate change, who has the wealth and the resources to support vulnerable nations through funding, through technology transfer. And I think that that is the general basis with which we use this opportunity to call attention to that. But what I would say is, we can't keep relying on these wealthy nations, these Western nations to save us. And I think something that I would really love to see is more regional collaboration, more strengthening of our regional networks to share resources, to share knowledge and strategies, to come together as a united front, which we have done in the past. But I just think it's so powerful for us as Caribbean nations to present a collective action, to amplify our voices and to increase our reach, because as small islands, they give us 2 minutes to speak and they're like, okay, next, and shuffle us along. And I think that we have to be intentional about making a ruckus, making a mark, not letting them ignore us in the way that they usually do. And I think that that will be a great stepping stone for us to be able to see some more of that meaningful engagement within the decision-making process, because we have such valuable things to share, and not just about the challenges that we face and our struggles, but also solutions to present.
Thank you very much, Lauren, for your contribution. And then we move on finally to Ferguson.
I totally agree with the contribution of Yemi and Lauren in that aspect. I always emphasize the need for the urgent need, of course, for a unified approach to climate justice. We as a Caribbean community needs to really embrace that togetherness of really assisting, being our brothers keepers in building not only for climate justice, but also for building resilience. And of course, we often I continue to call for more financial contributions and commitment to small island developing states and Caribbean. So I believe that this year's COP29 should have a strong focus on the reality that we as Caribbean people continue to face as it relates to the climate crisis. We are continuing to be battled and beaten by the climate crisis when we only contribute a reality of less than 10% to global gas emissions. So, of course, we need to take center stage on ensuring that we receive what is rightfully ours. Like, I'm literally claiming what is out there, what is rightfully ours. We need these funding to build our resilience. Every year, we can't stop production or building our own resilience from within to really prepare for a natural disaster when you guys are contributing largely to the climate crisis. So our leaders need to take a firm step and demand what is rightfully theirs. We as young people need to also contribute our voices. So I'm looking forward to young people's voices and decision makers as well coming together as a unified collective body in issuing that call for climate justice for Caribbean and small island developing states. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Ferguson. Back to you, Maxine. That was very well said. A few very important takeaways for me. I mean, we're hearing about financial support. We're hearing about more coming together as a Caribbean, and often, like we see so many times as a Caribbean people, when disaster strikes, we all come together. So what happens outside of that disaster time, right? And that is so important that we practice the same thing during a disaster, outside of a disaster, and that comes with economic development of each other. I see a lot of us having resources that we can all benefit, trading amongst each other, in terms of movement. I mean, we see it even with IOM, so many policies are being instated where people can move around and work in various countries and come back to their homes, without feeling like we're running away from one because we're leaving a disaster zone to go into another. So it's so important for us to think outside of these 5 months, about unity. Maxine.
Very much so. We know we're wrapping up. We saw after Hurricane Irma and Maria how important it was for people to be able to move off their small islands, their small spaces, into another space, even if just for a small period of time, to be able to recover some level of normalcy, to be able to even shop, like people who were moving between islands just to get supplies, to get a comfortable space for school. How do our regional policies facilitate that. And in the OACS, it was very easy. In CARICOM, and there were certain things that the OACS, I think, also learned, and they've moved on now. In CARICOM, sometimes we tend to be a little more discriminatory against each other, right? And you would have seen it show up in some of the countries. So I just really want to really thank you guys for coming on today. You've made really salient contributions to the discussion. As you said, Ferguson, it's important for youth to be involved, and I want to congratulate you on being among the youth who are involved in advocacy that is important for you and your life and lives of future generations. So thank you so much, and JL, thank you for hosting.
Thank you very much to you, Maxine, and thank you to our most, I call them esteemed, but they're distinguished. They're our distinguished guests. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for sharing your views, your opinions, your lived experiences as well with us. We truly appreciate that, and we love to engage with all of you, and of course we stay in touch with every single one of you. I just want to encourage folks that if you're just coming on, share the live, let somebody know, tag somebody. It's not just about commenting and putting your views and your opinions out there, but also getting other people involved in the discussion, because other people have their opinions as well. There are one of the things Yemi said, we're all different people, and there are intersections to everybody's perspective. So we have to take that into full focus when we think of climate justice, when we think of sustainability, when we think of resilience. I want to tell you guys, this is the third, and we have the fourth. The last one is tomorrow. So you have to tune in. Tune in early. I saw some people saying I'm here late. When the bell rings at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard and Atlantic Standard Time, you need to be here tomorrow when we wrap up for the final in our climate justice series, brought to you, of course, by the IOM Caribbean. And this is leading up to COP29, and I see good things coming out of this. And thanks again to all of you for tuning in, and we'll be back tomorrow. Bye-bye.